So what we will cover, if I can just ask James to move to the next slide. So the scope will cover the following. First, we will have Matthew Lowe, who will cover fundamentals of what is surveillance, methodical approach to aerial surveillance, and types of aircrafts. We will then hand over to Dan White, who will be presenting photos from actual oil spills and explain the difference between real spill and false positives. And then finally, we'll have James Pringle, who will talk about OSRL oil and water exercise and the common operating picture. So now over to Matthew.
Thank you, Marta. Just to reiterate, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where in the world you're calling in from. I'm actually sitting in Singapore right now. I'm a duty manager in Singapore, and my name is Matthew, of course, as Marta has introduced. The first slide I'm going to be talking about is what is surveillance, just to give you an introduction. The title of the webinar is obviously aerial surveillance. Aerial surveillance is obviously one of the most we could use the word traditional in a sense. When I first started doing oil spill response so many years ago, we were predominantly talking about aerial surveillance when we talked about surveillance. But today you can think of it in a much wider sense. In a nutshell, you can consider that to be anything that enhances your situational awareness. And the benefit of that is so you can make better decisions when you're responding to an oil spills, and better decisions translates to a more effective response, which is ultimately your goal when you've got oil in the water. I talked about aerial surveillance, but really the landscape for surveillance nowadays has really grown to much more than just aerial surveillance, much more than just putting somebody into an aircraft, holding a camera in his hand, flying around and taking photographs. Right today, when we talk about surveillance, we're talking about things like autonomous underwater vehicles, which are vehicles that can travel under the surface of the water, collecting oceanographic data for you and also detecting the presence of oil. There are a series of different platforms that can be launched off the deck of a vessel, of a surface vessel, on the surface of the sea. So we're talking things like unmanned aerial vehicles, surveillance kites, and also tethered balloons, all of which helps to enhance our situational awareness from the surface of the sea. Moving upwards, we talked about aerial surveillance, so we have aircraft, and of course moving into outside the Earth's atmosphere, satellite surveillance is something that has gotten very big in recent times as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So what do we do when we talk about surveillance? Obviously, the first thing that you want to do is verification of your reports of oil. You want to verify whether there really is oil in the water that has been reported. You want to, of course, be able to quickly eliminate any false alarms or any false information or false reports that have come into you. You want to know whether there's really oil in the water. You want to know important data about the oil spill, things like the location of the oil spill, very importantly, the origin of the oil. You want to know whether that oil belongs to you in the first place. That's a very good piece of information to know. Obviously, where the oil is moving, and also the state of the oil in terms of its weathering. So these are all information that you can see by flying over an oil spill. This can be done obviously via aerial surveillance, by a man in an aircraft, or some of the other platforms that we talked about earlier. Doing aerial surveillance, something that you naturally can do is try to do quantification of the oil spill. So we have an established approach. Most of you should be familiar with the bond agreement. So we can use that approach to estimate the amount of oil in the water based on the size of the oil spill and also its appearance. Something else that you can try to do during aerial surveillance is obviously try to support your operational assets on the water and help your assets on the water to deliver a more effective response. And moving on, finally, you can gather that data into reporting for your incident command team and also into visualization, which you can feed into a common operating picture. Can I have the next slide, please? And really this picture is just to give you a good example of operational support that you can offer to your response assets during an oil spill. So imagine this, you have a large area with lots of oil in the water and you have multiple response vessels in the water. So imagine how having this bird's eye view, like we are seeing in this photograph, imagine how useful that could be to your response assets on the surface of the water. So imagine you in a plane, you had this view, a bird's eye view of all your vessels and where the oil is. And imagine if you had a means of communication to the masters of those vessels. You can imagine that you would easily be able to direct them where to go. So vessel A, oil on your port side, vessel B, moving forward 2 nautical miles, oil is there. So information like this very simply can help you to gather more oil and create a more effective response. Next slide, please. So quickly, which aircraft is better? We're going to quickly compare the differences between helicopter and obviously fixed-wing aircraft. So helicopters, they obviously give you more flexibility in the sense that they can maneuver, they can fly slowly, they can hover over points of interest, give you a better look at what you want to look at. Also potentially better viewing angles because of the position of the windows and the viewpoints. Fixed-wing aircraft, obviously the main advantage is longer range and endurance. Typically you would find more seating available as well. So it depends how many observers you had and how many people you want to put into the air. But very importantly, ultimately you are limited to which aircraft you're going to have. So basically the answer to the question of which aircraft is better is the best aircraft is the one that you have. Importantly, as long as you can have some assurance that the aircraft is safe to fly in, that's obviously the most important. If the aircraft is safe to fly in, that is probably the best aircraft for you to use at that point in time. And which also highlights the point of doing preparedness. So, for example, offshore drilling projects, you may already have access to the helicopters which you use for crew transfers. So, just getting the arrangements in place to activate these aerial assets during an oil spill incident would be beneficial as well. Next slide, please. Okay, the next section will be done by Dan, who's going to take you through some false positives and the appearances of oil. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Matt. Can we have the next slide, please? I've got a series of photos here where we're going to take you through where there's some real oil and some false positives. So really what I'd like is just to get everyone to have a guess as to what we think we have here, whether this is a real oil spill or if it's a false positive. If anyone's willing to let us know, that'd be great. If not, I can start talking through it. No, very quiet. Okay, so sorry, what was that?
As a complete amateur, as it were, it looks like oil to me.
Yes, good answer. So yeah, if you can just next slide. So red tick there. So that is an oil spill. So I guess for me, as a responder, there are 5 questions I ask myself when I'm conducting an oil spill, where I come across something that isn't obviously an oil slick itself. So the first question I'd typically ask is, is there a sheen visible around the outside of the oil? Could you just go back to the previous slide, James? So is there a sheen around the outside of the oil? So here you can see there's a sheen around the outside of what you can see there is the thicker oil in the middle. The next question I'd ask is, can you see a smoothing effect of the oil on the surface of the water? Because if you can't see that, chances are that it could be subsurface. The next question I'd ask is, again, if you're still not sure, if I view this anomaly from different angles, with the sun behind me, with the sun in my face, and then off to the sides, am I able to get a better picture of what's going on? If I'm still unsure at that point, my next point of call would be to try and get lower and get a closer look at the oil spill itself. So normally when we're conducting surveillance, quite often we're in the sort of 1,500 to up to 3,000 foot altitude. If I've got something I'm really not sure of at that point, then I'm going to want to drop down to about 500 foot and get as close as I can to get a real close look at the actual oil spill, and then that might identify what we're actually looking at there. And if that doesn't work, then the next thing that I'm really thinking of is, okay, well, what's my scenario? What has my modelling said? Do I know what I'm expecting to see with regards to the oil weathering? Does this match the other oil that I'm seeing? Is it moving in the right direction? And then I guess the final thing that I'm really thinking of, okay, well, if all of this doesn't work with the Mark 1 eyeball and I'm still unclear as to whether it's an oil slick or not, then certainly for us, when we respond, we will normally respond with remote sensors. And when I talk about remote sensors, we're talking infrared cameras, ultraviolet sensors, and those can be used to help me further identify whether it's an oil spill or not. So they're the 5 questions that I keep in my mind when I'm going through this. So as we go through these slides, keep that in your mind. So this next one, what do we think? Is this an oil spill or not?
I think not.
I think not. Okay, good answer. So in this case, I believe it's actually a kelp bed. So that is below the surface of the water. You can't see a sheen around the outside, and it's a bit grainy here, especially with it being transmitted over Teams. But you can't see that smoothing effect either. So yeah, this was actually a kelp bed in this scenario. Next slide, please. What about this one? We didn't talk so much about stranded oil, but what's everyone's thoughts here?
Again, not.
Okay, so good thoughts there. Now, it can be a lot more difficult to identify whether a stranding is an oil spill or not. And the final way of finding out for sure is to get someone down on the beach and take a sample. But we respond all over the world, and certain areas around the world. So if you take the west coast of Africa, for example, they're renowned in that region for having a really quite black to browny organic matter which comes out from the watercourses and then grounds or strands rather on the beaches. In this case, this is actually oil from an oil spill. But again, what you need to do to factor in is this oil is, does this fall in line with the modelling? Am I seeing oil stranded where I'd expect to see it? Am I seeing any other oil out to sea? And is that behaving in the same manner? So am I seeing sheening coming off? Am I seeing that flattening of the capillary waves on the surface of the sea? Next slide, please. What about this one? What do we think with this?
Obviously, no.
Yep, definitely not. So I'm not 100% sure what this is here, but this is not an oil spill. But what I would say is, the colour of oil can be very different. So there was an oil spill in Australia just before the Macondo incident, so it doesn't get talked about as much. But that had a really vivid orange emulsified appearance as that oil weathered. So the colour you can't always go on, but in this case it doesn't appear to be weathering in the manner we would expect to see the oil. You don't see that sheen effect, and it appears to be behaving a bit different. Good observation. Next slide, please. What about here?
No.
No. So, do you know what you would class this as? What's commonly called? Convergence line. So this is where you have two different bodies of water coming together, and that is a convergence line between them. And that happens quite frequently where you have an estuary or something like that coming out into the sea, and you can have these really vivid convergence lines. But a word of caution with these is it's always really worthwhile, if you have an oil spill in the vicinity, having a close look at that convergence line, because oil can be entrained within that at times. So that's something to bear in mind. The next slide, please. What about this one?
No.
No. Okay. So this is actually a heavily emulsified oil. And where it's heavily emulsified, at that point, it's not really giving off any sheen. So it's a little bit unusual to I guess, my first rule. However, where it's so heavily emulsified, the way it's kind of flowing there, it's kind of almost following that windrow type characteristic. And if I was in this situation and this was the only patch of oil I'd seen, my next port of call would be to get down lower, have a good look at it, and if I had remote sensors available, I'd be looking to use my infrared camera here to try and see if I can identify it, because the infrared camera will give me an indication of thickness of the oil. So if it's not an oil and it's actually in the water column itself and submerged, then I wouldn't pick it up with that sensor. So that's the type of thing I'd be looking to do here. Next slide, please. And that was the end of those. So really, the main thing that I would take away from this is that, even as experienced responders, we do come across stuff sometimes where we think, I don't know at first glance whether that's an oil spill or not. So that's why I always have those 5 questions in the back of my mind so that I can interrogate it. And then for me, if I provide advice on whether it is an oil spill or not, I would use those questions to provide the justification for where, yes, that is, we believe that is a hydrocarbon, or we believe it's a false positive and not a hydrocarbon, because we can't see a sheen around the perimeter of the anomaly. We don't see a smoothing effect on the surface. Viewed from different angles, it revealed no further information. We've used our remote sensing devices and we weren't able to see it on the surface with the infrared camera. We took a closer look and that revealed no further information, and it doesn't fit within the predicted modelling outputs either. So they're the type of things that we would use to provide a bit more science to those visual observations. And that's it from me. Over to James, I think.
Excellent, thanks Dan. Hi everyone, James Pringle here. I'm going to be briefly talking about a case study, and in particular the oil and water exercise that OSRL done in June 2017. So the exercise was based in the UK, off the southwest of the coast of the Isle of Wight, and we released 500 litres of Wild Basin crude. And one of the main reasons for the exercise was to see how we could integrate the different surveillance tools. So Dan and Matthew both briefly touched on the different sensors, and Matthew also touched on what we do with standard aerial surveillance. So we really wanted to understand how we can integrate all the different tools in the toolbox to provide enhanced situational awareness, and also to identify what any limitations or challenges we've used in those tools are. So as part of the exercise, we had quite a couple of vessels on the water surface, one releasing the crude, but also with dispersing capability to disperse the oil if necessary, and also containment recovery capability. We had a small rib to support with doing some of the surveillance operations for autonomous underwater vehicles, and that was also enable us to do some fluorometry testing. We had a second vessel for deploying the other autonomous underwater vehicles, the slightly larger ones. And combined into all that, that's where we started to look into sort of the surveillance side. So what were we kind of looking at? What technologies were we trying to validate and test? So we started off with satellites. We were looking at both radar and optical. We had 2 aircraft up, our standard UKCS aircraft, which is the image on the left there, UKCS, and we have recently fitted that with our new turret, which had a UV and IR sensor on board, among other capabilities. And one of the primary reasons and justifications for actually doing the oil and water exercise, apart from looking at how we can integrate all the tools, was to test and validate the ultraviolet sensor and the infrared sensor. We also, with our partners 2XL, who operate GUKCS, utilised their aircraft with a hyperspectral camera, as it was a great opportunity to understand how we can collect that data in hyperspectral imagery, how long does it take to interpret it, and what kind of outputs do we get. We also used unmanned aerial vehicles to kind of understand what value they can provide. Can they be used strategically, tactically? We actually chose to use them more as a tactical tool in this case, so identifying where the thicker parts of the oil were and directing the vessel to those. We tested our surveillance kite, so it's more of a simpler tool with just a visual camera on board. And then I'll briefly touch on the non-surveillance, the aerial surveillance aspects, but we used autonomous underwater vehicles like slocum gliders with fluorescent sensors on to help us to identify how well the oil was dispersed into the water column. Our standard C3 fluorometers were also used, and we also put quite a bit of work into communications, filming the back deck of the vessel, the operations going on, to understand how that looked. So another part to the exercise was, with all this data, feeding back into a command center or feeding back into the in-field leads, we wanted to understand, with this quantity of data, how does that look and feel in a spill, and how do we use that data, and how can we really develop the procedures and processes after this exercise to ensure that we're only recording data of value to minimize that large stream of data, so we don't become overwhelmed with it. So to go into some of the tools a little bit more, we use satellite imagery, as I said, both optical and radar. The optical imagery was unable to detect. It was a low resolution imagery, but it was a small volume of oil, and it did spread out quite quickly. The overpass didn't happen until after the dispersant had sprayed, so quite rightly, with the dispersion of the oil, we wouldn't be expecting to see too much from the optical imagery after the fact, and that's what we got. So with the radar imagery, so we're using synthetic aperture radar, and typically with SAR, as it's more commonly known, it relies on the fact that the oil dampens the capillary waves on the water surface, and based on also the dielectric properties of the oil, what this causes is a reduction in backscatter when the radar antenna sends out its beam and it receives it. It creates a dark patch. So as you can see in the image down there, like pieces of land, you can see some of the white dots of the vessels. They're producing a strong return. But you can see the 2 polygons showing where there's potential oil, which was in the area of the release. That it's slightly darker. There's a lot more, obviously, interpretation that goes on there and analysis of the results. But what we did find is, so commonly it's said that you need reasonable weather conditions on the sea surface. So roughly you need wind speeds of about 3 to 12 meters a second, because without those waves, you're not going to get the dampening of the capillary waves, which means you're not going to necessarily get any returned data to the satellite, which will show oil. So, and that's what we received. So the early images, and it was very calm initially during the day on the sea surface. We didn't detect oil. And as we quite rightly put there, that was due to the weather conditions. However, the later images did capture low to medium confidence anomaly. And once again, the reason why it wasn't high confidence, even though that we know that there's oil out there, was primarily because the water surface, it was an extremely calm day. I was actually up in the UKCS aircraft, and I haven't seen the sea surface around that location like that before. It was very calm, very glassy. So I'll keep back on satellites. So that was quite interesting. It was being able to test some of the different satellite sensors and see how they work. And I think for us, it kind of really still reinstilled that they're very much a strategic tool. Still, I think there's a lot of advancements with the miniaturization of satellites, faster data processing using enhanced algorithms or AI, and that's maybe pushing it into the realm of being a tactical tool. But we still primarily see it as a strategic tool, as something that can get a wide area, it can get, large areas in one image than you're going to be able to get with an aircraft. And you can use that information to help you task your aircraft, to help task maybe a vessel to go out to do further surveillance. So that's kind of how we see satellites sometimes slotting into that spot. So as I mentioned previously, the UKCS aircraft, we had just fitted our new sensors. So we had an ultraviolet sensor and a IR sensor. Among that, it has a laser rangefinder, it has HD visual optical in there. And it's also, you're able to track the bore site so you can map around a spill. And it's all integrated into mission software, which enables you to combine all those outputs. So you'll see in the bottom left picture, that's a image from the ultraviolet sensor. Now, interestingly, to kind of see how this all combines. Now, we always do aerial surveillance with a person, where possible, and certainly to do quantification. But sometimes when possible, it's great to have different tools to support that verification and quantification. Now, on the day, as I said, I was up there, and we had the UV and IR sensors, and I couldn't see oil from a visual perspective for at least around the first 20 minutes of the release. Now, granted, it was 500 litres, so it's not going to be a huge spill, but it did start to spread out quite quickly. But based on a couple of factors as well, with the low zenith of the sun at the time, so it was relatively early in the morning, I could not personally see it. However, the ultraviolet sensor, which will pick up oil down to around 0.01 microns thickness, the UV sensor automatically picked up almost as soon as it was released. The benefits with the UV was that you can see the entirety of the slick down to, as I said, around 0.01 microns thickness. So in terms of trying to map out the entirety of the slick, that's a really good tool. On the right-hand side, you'll see the infrared sensor. The infrared sensor that we have is operating in the far infrared range, so it's roughly around 7.5 to 14 nanometers, microns, sorry. And what it's detecting is detecting both the temperature difference and the emissivity of the infrared radiation coming off different objects. So there's based on literature, roughly infrared won't pick up oil below around 10 microns. It varies between 10 to 70 microns in thickness. So if we translate to the Bond color code, that roughly relates to around the metallic thickness. Now, it's at the metallic thickness that we start to say, well, that's the minimum sort of level of thickness when you can start doing offshore containment recovery, potential dispersant operations. So from a tactical point of view, that's when the infrared camera really comes into its own. You can see that both of those pictures are the same picture, but with different sensors. And you can see the UVs picking up a much wider slick than the IR. Now, the benefit from this is you can use that IR image to direct the vessels to thicker parts of the slick. And also, if you're, like Dan was mentioning with false positives, If you have, for instance, a sheen, or you're not too sure if it's a sheen, you're not too sure if it's oil, you can use these sensors if they're available to help form a better picture. Yeah, it's not the only tools, but there are extra tools in the toolbox that can help with your verification and quantification. So that was a great success in the exercise, and it was really good to see how the sensors were working. I won't go too much into it, but if anybody does want any further information, we have some posters and technical information sheets, which I'm happy to share out. So linking back to how does that all look in terms of the common operating picture. Obviously, with the common operating picture, it's not just focused on surveillance, it's on all the information that's going in, it's financial data, it's sensitive areas, but the surveillance stuff is there coming in, helping to provide a bit more situational awareness and feeding into the common operating picture. So we had set up a room in Southampton's base during the oil and water exercise, where we fed that data into the into the common operating picture, which was allowing us to get a better understanding of what was happening in the field, what data was valuable, and a lot of that has really kind of fed back into what we've done on future spills and what we've done on future exercises to make sure that we're not overloading ourselves with data. A good one is how that's translated into UAVs. So instead of having data constantly live streamed back to an emergency operations center or to command, it's typically the streaming finishes at the point of the person who's on the shoreline. So they'll be seeing the live stream from the UAV, but they'll just be taking clips. And then it's those clips and the reports. It's the analysed information, or the analysed data turned into information that then goes back to the operations centre, the incident command, because that's providing them knowledge to inform their decisions. So there's lots of little bits around that we learnt, and that's it for the case study. It was a bit of a brief overview. We did try quite a few tools. Happy to field any questions or go into any bits if anybody wants to explore any of them a bit more. Back to you, Marta.
There's our emails are there on the slide, so please feel free to contact us after the webinar if you have any other questions coming up. Thank you very much for your participation.